Hey, welcome to Let 'Em Talk. I'm Paul DiRienzo. We had a really cool show in store for you. I'm really looking forward to this show. We're going to talk about the book, A Narco History. It's about how the United States and Mexico jointly created the Mexican drug war. We have the authors, Carmen Boullosa and Mike Wallace, who are here with us. And I've already read this book cover to cover. You can see it's dog-eared, even though it's signed. You know, I should have put it away as a collector's item, but actually I had to read it because it was fascinating and I loved it, and I have a lot of questions to ask. So welcome to Let Them Talk. And let me begin by asking, I don't know where to start. Why did you decide to write a book about the Mexican drug war? Let me give a little background. Now, Mike Wallace, you're really an expert on New York City history, right? And what is your famous book that everybody knows, that everybody I know in New York has on their bookshelf?
Gotham,
right? That big, thick, heavy book about
big mother. Yes,
Yeah.
that you have to reinforce your shelves if you got it. And I'm working on the successor volume, so it's going to really put a stress on bookcases.
Oh, right, two of them. And that's the history of New York City, which has a fascinating history worth several volumes of big, thick books. So, all right, Gotham, look at your bookshelf. You have it on your bookshelf. I know the followers of this program are the type of people who have a lot of books on their bookshelves. All right, great. And so why did you decide now to write a book after writing books about New York City, to write a book about Mexico? And maybe at that moment I'll introduce your co-author, Carmen Boullosa, who is from Mexico, right? And is a Mexican person in the United States. And
well, there's your answer.
Okay.
I mean, Carmen and I have been married for 10, 12 years. She is one of Mexico's leading novelists, poets, playwrights, filmmakers. She writes a column for a local Mexican newspaper. She's totally wired into this world, and we have developed a split-screen existence, so we're back and forth a lot, and we have a place in Mexico City. So this was something that was not abstract and distant. This was something that, when you're in Mexico, is omnipresent. It's in every cloud. It's behind every corner. And so it's inescapable. I myself would never in a million years have undertaken this kind of venture were it not for the interest piqued through Carmen, but also because Carmen was the co-author.
all right.
I mean, I don't even read Spanish or speak Spanish. But I was able to be useful because there's a huge literature that I was unaware of that's in English, done in the United States, about this so-called Mexican drug war.
Okay.
But it's Carmen who knows the scene and has lived with it as it developed. And
Well, I would say it's fair to say that a lot of, if not most Americans at one time in their lives have been consumers of narcotics that came through Mexico to the United States. I mean, it's a rite of passage in this country, and despite the laws against drugs, it's the most widely broken law in America, probably, from marijuana to methamphetamine and everything in between. So obviously, the United States is tied directly to the drug culture in wherever, in Mexico, in Southeast Asia, and all these different places, or where we consume our drugs from.
It's not only the United States. I think that it's not that I think, I know all over the world people use psychoactives. And they use them if they have money. Then they use psychoactives that are either legal, like alcohol or coffee or sugar, or then illegal in some countries, like in this one, marijuana, etc., cocaine, etc. So people use psychoactives. It's since ever. What we argue in the book is criminalization of the use of psychoactives is what changes totally the scene. It's not that sugar is terrible. I mean, if one wants to talk badly about a psychoactive, we should talk about sugar. Sugar is poison, kills people. There are so many health issues with people that are addicted to sugar and need sugar and consume sugar with no restriction, even though it is really a poison.
Well, I mean, more to the point, last year, according to the CDC, 480,000 Americans died of nicotine-related usage. 88,000 Americans died of alcohol-related problems. So criminalization is the key word here. It's not just that the U.S. imports vast quantities of drugs, it's that they also criminalize the use of those drugs and do their best to stop the drugs from coming in. So part of the U.S. is doing this, the other part is doing this. And another part still is selling vast quantities of weapons across the border, which are then used in the businesses that spring up in providing the United States with what it says it doesn't want.
So. Now, okay, that's with
now
that
the
introduction.
strange thing is why we both entered to it, because
yes.
I am a poet, a novelist, a fiction writer. I write in the cultural pages of a newspaper. It's not my theme. The problem is that it became, for me, it became an obsession to see how violence that comes out of the so-called drug war has really poisoned the life in Mexico for many areas. The amount of murders, the corpses that the drug war has produced, the decapitated, the everything, it's horrendous. It's a war going on, and a completely a war created, in fact, by the users in the United States and Europe and the rest of the countries, and by the criminalization or the prohibition of these substances. Mexico doesn't, all the countries in the world have a relation between income and taking certain psychoactives. Mexico breaks the law. Mexico is not a country where people use drugs in the same proportion, uses them less. Don't ask me why. It doesn't have to do with the Latino culture or Hispanic culture, because Brazil, Argentina, they do.
The Catholic religion?
No,
guilt?
no.
Catholic guilt?
Argentina is also, it has nothing to do with guilt. It has to do maybe with a kind intense social life. I don't know. Argentina,
family life.
They have money. People have money. They use them. Always in a proportion. Russia, everywhere. Not in Mexico. It's a little bit down. It's down.
Right.
Now,
so it's a problem of tremendous impact on Mexico that is sourced in other countries like the United States. Now, what I wanted to
mainly
in the United States and other countries as well, but mostly the United States, Europe to a certain degree, wherever there's a large amount of money. But I think the United States being right there next to Mexico.
Not only that, it's the capability of purchasing them.
Right.
The market is enormous. Sorry for my English. I'm Mexican.
No, it's
so
an enormous market. I clear it. Now, so let me begin and talk about your book a little bit, A Narco History, fascinating book. You begin the book with a discussion of the massacre that we've heard somewhat about, the Ayotzinapa massacre, which occurred. And I assume it's a massacre because the remains of the people who were killed was never found. So we're assuming that it was a massacre, and that is what I believe you say in the book did occur. So why do you begin with what happened in Ayotzinapa, and what exactly did happen there? What is the import of that?
Well, we began with it. It's not been the mass murder, the bigger mass murder in Mexico.
Right.
Well, we haven't seen their bodies. The claim of the parents is they took them alive. We want them alive back. The claim is perfectly legitimate. They should have never disappeared. They should have never been taken out.
What actually happened?
Nobody really knows what actually happened. It's been a long story of trying to finding out. We know that the municipal police of 2 towns were involved in kidnapping them. We then don't know precisely what happened with them. We know the 2 municipal police were there. The army watched it happening. So there was, the federal police also knew this was going on, helped even to something. So they were all aware of this situation. But then what else happened with the students, we don't know. It's a long and...
I mean, the official story is that these were students from a teacher's training institute in a little town that was near this other little town. And the other town was in fact controlled by gangsters who were shipping heroin, particularly to Chicago.
The wife of the mayor.
The wife of the mayor was, you know, again, according to the predominant explanation of this, was the head of the gang, and the police department and the gangsters were fungible, interchangeable. You didn't know who you were dealing with. And for a variety of possible explanations, these people were taken off buses, taken to a dump site in the countryside, and murdered. And then their bodies burned beyond the finding, except some of the ashes were dumped in a nearby river. Bits of bone were recovered and assessed by DNA experts, and 1 or 2 students were identified. There are still people who believe this whole thing is a charade, that the military did it, you know, because there's so much intense, well-merited intense suspicion of the state and its complicity, the corruption, which really is one of our major arguments, that this kind of corruption has been going on for 100 years. I mean, our argument really is that the use of various drugs, heroin, opium, cocaine, dates back to 1909. And in a series of laws that were passed in the early 20th century, the U.S. criminalized their use internally. And over a century, as the source of these drugs shifted from Turkey in one instance, Colombia in another instance, to overwhelmingly coming up through Mexico, the U.S. official policy was to force Mexico as best they could into acting in stopping the flow of drugs that the U.S. itself was unable or somewhere or another unwilling to do. So that's the big picture, and we look at a sequence of events where in the 1930s, when Mexico tried to shift, because it had already synced its own drug laws to the U.S. drug laws, and in the 1930s there was an effort to break away from that, particularly around marijuana, and the head of the health department said, this notion about marijuana being a killer weed is complete nonsense. Also, if you criminalize it, you're going to lead to massive corruption of the police and the army and the military and the higher public officials. Bad idea. And it was the U.S., through the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, that forced Mexico to go back to the punitive model rather than the public health model that they were trying for.
Right.
Richard Nixon gave it a go, forcing Mexico into doing spraying and stuff.
Right.
Ronald Reagan had his own war on drugs, and that involved the decertification program, basically telling Mexico, if you don't do what we want in terms of current methodologies for stopping all of this stuff, increasing militarization primarily, then we will cut off all foreign aid to you and we will blackball you in international aid agencies, and you can't afford to do that because you're in dire straits, in part because you're tied to the American economy.
How did that survive into the, now we're in the era, you know, of Clinton, well, George W. Bush is no liberal, and I find in himself a recovering alcoholic sometimes could be a little bit even more let's put it this way, even more strict about their attitudes towards those people who would continue to use. And now the Obama administration, President Obama, who admitted not only using drugs but selling drugs in his biography, you know, we've inhaled. Why is this continuing now, despite the reality that we are not in the era of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, we're in a different era?
Well, the big news is that it's beginning not to happen. The legalization in several states and the likelihood of more legalization if California votes next year is the big news. If that actually goes through, it could be extremely difficult to continue with the existing regime. And there are many agencies, the DEA most famously, who are bureaucratically devoted to continuing the war on drugs because that's what their budget depends on.
So we're talking with with Carmen Boullosa and Mike Wallace, who are the authors of this book, A Narco History. And it's in bookstores around the country. You can get it on Amazon anywhere you want, and it's a great read. And both authors are, as you can see, very knowledgeable about the subject. And Carmen, I wanted to ask you because at least what you get from the media representation, and I think you've pretty much supported it, is that what's happened in Mexico is almost a total breakdown of the rule of law. And it seems like most of the time, at least parts of the country, are under the control of gangsters, and we're not just talking about Al Capone controlling one side of Chicago, but we're talking about whole states being run by criminal gangs in which outrageous murders. I mean, a few people, as horrible as that is, ISIS, beheads a person here, a person there, a few people here, a few people there. It's terrible what they do, but yet we don't see the same kind of outrage when
2,000 Mexicans, at least 2,000 Mexicans have been decapitated. The story is pretty horrendous in the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. This has happened in such a short period of time, and the escalade of violence has aroused. And I think that the situation was there already, but President Calderon decided to declare openly a frontal war against drugs. Not that the other presidents hadn't played with it back and forth, even with the army and the police, but President Calderon put the army in the streets, and the army and the police forces and special police forces, and this created more violence, more guns all around, more corruption, more power for the gangs. The gangs now, or the criminal organizations now, not only control the illegal substances, but also control the traffic of migrants from Central America to the States, or from Mexico to the United States, migrants, sex trade. So it's horrendous because it's human trade, human lives, and Mexico in the middle of this, like if all Mexico turned into a frontier of violence. I would not say that the gangs control whole areas. I would say that the situation is much more complicated. Much more complicated because the state is in all areas, they're present, and in some parts more cooperative with the criminals, and more corrupt or less corrupt. You see it with the number of corpses. They favor the situation. Some authorities favor, some others don't. We used to have only one party that ran the whole country. So even though there was traffic of substances, less than today because the market was lesser, because Mexico was not the center or the capital of the drug traffic, it hadn't happened yet. As Mike said, it was in other countries before, had other paths to come and nourish the United States with
pleasure. And now Mexico is the main.
But now Mexico is the main path and a center where things gather, meaning we get the China ingredients, the Chinese ingredients, the Colombian or Bolivian ingredients. So we get ingredients
even
and
methamphetamine, which is
yes.
It was doesn't seem indigenous to Mexico. In my travels there, I never saw people doing meth. It seems to be an American thing.
None of those substances are indigenous to Mexico. Right. Marijuana arrived to Mexico with the Spaniards. It did not exist. It was not a psychoactive that existed in pre-Hispanic times. It came with them. So none of the substances we are talking about are indigenous, to say so.
So it was an entrepreneurial response. When the U.S. added methamphetamines to their list of prohibited, and then they added precursor drugs, that's why you have to sign in triplicate when you want Sudafed in the drugstore.
I noticed that, yeah.
Well, gangsters in parts of Mexico on the Pacific coast arrange deals with the Chinese, and they would import large quantities of precursor chemicals, set up laboratories in the hillsides, and then shove the stuff into the same channels that were being used to send basically opium and marijuana.
And when we had only one party controlling all the country, any operation that happened that was illegal was surveyed by a state that knew more or less how to manage it. But now we have several parties.
You're saying the government of Mexico in the past, when it was a one state, could manage all of this, and
let them work in a way, as may I say, it happens in the States, because the drugs in fact flow to the United States and then they are distributed. And I cannot believe that the government or the governments are so inefficient that they don't see them. I do think there has to be corruption and a kind of let it be organization so that you don't have chopped heads in the streets. That's
in the United States.
In the United States.
Well, there's been a long tradition of it. I mean, remember, the U.S. is in a weird position. We not only criminalized opium and cocaine and all the rest, but we criminalized alcohol. I mean, nobody else really did that. And it was a complete disaster. And one of the things that happened was the corruption, including the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and state agencies and city agencies. And one of the reasons that we repealed prohibition was because A, it didn't work, and B, it led to spectacular corruption, and C, it led to killings and deaths in the street. Well, all that's going on in Mexico now.
Multiplicated by other factors, by the factor of poverty, by the factor of the state of Mexico used to be in the 70s and 80s, used to at least pretend they were looking at all the people, public education, public health, and then the agenda changed. NAFTA, the agenda, the economic agenda of the state changed.
So you think NAFTA had
so
an effect
now
on
we
this?
have partially, it's not the only ingredient. There are many ingredients to build this.
Well, NAFTA plus the larger neoliberal ideology.
Exactly.
Most of the presidents in the 70s and the 80s studied at Harvard Business School and imbibed the notion that
the presidents of
government
Mexico
is bad and liberalize the flow of the market. And some of the consequences were that many small farmers were bankrupted by competition with giant U.S. agribusiness. And they either moved to the cities and piled up in giant slums. I mean, Mexico City was a relatively small city. Now there's, what, 25 million
people? It was
people.
3 million. It had 3 million inhabitants when I was born. And now there are 22 million inhabitants.
Or they went to the
urban
factories along the Texas, California, etc. border, the maquiladoras, cheap labor for that. Or they worked for the drug lords.
Or they came to the United States, because also we have to remember that we have 11.4 million Mexicans today working in the United States. And they used to be 12.3. The traffic has diminished because it's become so risky to cross. Now the traffic of humans, as I said, it's in the hands of the criminal organizations.
As it becomes more difficult, so a lot of these schemes,
more violent,
like Mr. Trump's schemes to build walls and to make it more difficult to come, even more difficult, what that does is empowers organized crime figures.
Obviously.
Well, but also,
and also
I mean,
make people pay them less, suffer people, because people come because there is work and the work is needed. And it's a madness. It's a the Trump. Let's not talk about Trump, because that really.
Well, but the thing about Trump is that
that's why he likes doing that. You know that he's doing that on purpose.
The numbers are wrong. I mean, the amount of people crossing the border now is dropped dramatically, and it's a combination of some degree of border defenses, but it's also some improved possibilities either in the illegal or in the legal economy of Mexico, so people would just as soon stay. Used to be you could cross over and come back, and now you're locked in a rigid format.
What is this? If drugs are legalized in California, like they might be next year,
Yeah.
Yes.
and several other states, and you're talking about maybe a third of the country in a marijuana legalized situation, which is the largest of all of them, of all the drugs that are brought in. What effect would that have? What would the narco traffickers do? And I've heard of more than a few who have assaulted drug treatment professionals, who have assaulted activists who wanted to legalize drugs because of their fear that if drugs are legalized, they'll lose a huge part of their incomes.
Well, in Mexico, they assaulted these centers, these rehab centers, for other reasons. They were taking vengeance because they were losing their slaves, not their consumers, but the people that work for them for free, or work, because many of the people who work with the drug industry are slaves. They are enslaved. Some of them really don't receive any money. It's a panorama that's incredibly painful to see. There's this very famous story of Rancho Buffalo that Mike knows well. How many people were there totally enslaved, Mike?
Thousands and thousands.
Enslaved. They couldn't go out, they couldn't come in.
Working
So
in drug
when
production.
they
Right.
assault these centers in Mexico, they do it because they are recapturing their captives, to say so.
Yeah, but the major effect has already been foreshadowed. The price of marijuana going to the growers has dropped already dramatically. And if it was legalized and grown in the U.S. and higher quality, truth be told, and the corporations are circling, ready to jump into this
Oh, they
whole
already
new
are,
business.
Colorado, different places.
Huge amounts of money are expected from that. It means that, in fact, what's likeliest, if nothing else changes, is they simply are already switching to opium. I mean, one reason that there's been a surge of heroin. Is because, in fact, they're getting out of marijuana, they're getting into heroin.
I
And
think it
already
has
they're
to
talking
be-
about decriminalizing heroin. Even in New York is on the verge of
Yes.
decriminalizing heroin. Just yesterday, the mayor was talking about it. So
Yes, I mean,
Yes,
if
the
you,
decriminalization would be part of the solution, I think, and then the guns.
which doesn't mean, throwing it open
Right.
to anybody.
we didn't talk about that. We only have a minute to go. But the guns that go from the United States to
Oh, the
Mexico,
guns.
the drugs come here and guns are going to Mexico.
Exactly. The guns come from the United States or travel from the United States. The guns are killing Americans here, and they are killing much more Mexicans in the South. And it's not only the guns. It's all the structure of violence. All the jails of the United States are full of victims of this idiotic war too. And they happen to be blacks and poors.
All right.
most
Thank you
of
very
them.
much, Carmen Boullosa and Mike Wallace, the authors of A Narco History. Run out and get this book. This is one of the most important books that you can get today. Thank you so much for
Probably
joining
best
us.
online. It's not always in bookstores.
All right, get it
Amazon,
online then.
etc.
Let them talk. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you,
There
thank
are.
you.
Bye-bye. That's it.
Thanks a lot.